At this point we continue to pay tribute to Bill Gates. But we also know that while he had so frankly and succinctly raised the problem, that the problem is not solved by his proposed solution. So where is the way out? Many people have thought about the solution before Bill Gates. Marx's contemporary, a man named Proudhon, the French socialist, he had espoused socialist ideas earlier than Marx, and he had published a book. Before Marx formed his own independent thought and caused philosophical revolution, Proudhon's book has been published. The book is called What is Private Property? What is private property? The book concludes, in a word, that private property is stealing. And Marx was very excited when he read this book. He was very respectful of Proudhon at this time, he was full of admiration for him. Who in all of Europe would say this? Capital, which is a type of private property, is actually stealing. And he's using a very crude language to say the truth. Marx sees the light. You say property is stealing, you've already told me what capital is, it's irrational. Theft is of course irrational, it's a power. So this book is very significant. And then Marx examines what else did Proudhon say. What else does Proudhon say to reject capitalism? There is only one way, that everybody does what? In our society, eliminate the capitalist, everyone is a wage worker. There are only wage earners, every laborer to contribute his own labor, and take his own share of wages, that would be a beautiful day. But then Proudhon finds that he can't develop this ideas further. He has taken the first step and finds that capital is an irrational power, so he calls it theft. He could not go on to the second step. Rejecting capitalism requires a sensuous power, it is not a rational undertaking. Use power to deal with power, right? You need power to counter power, not to invent a new sort of right to deal with it. Marx wrote in 1844, in his famous essay called Introduction to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, that material forces can only be destroyed by material forces. The critique of weapons cannot replace the weapon of criticism. These words are very powerful, that is to say, in capitalist society, new sensuous forces will gradually grow up, and this material force will eventually abolish the power of capital. In which social class does Marx later look for this power to happen? The proletariat. So from here the theory of proletarian revolution emerges, logical or not? Logical. The overthrow of the capitalist world is not a matter of theory, but of new material or sensuous power. Now I think that's unlikely. The contemporary working class, especially in the developed countries, is fully integrated into the capitalist system, accepting all the logic of the capitalist world, so that later came Western Marxism. In the 20th century the Frankfurt School addresses this problem. Because the working class as a revolutionary force has disappeared, they look for a new sensible man. Where does he come from? They have been looking for a long time. And then comes Marcuse, you've heard of him? One of the leaders of the Frankfurt School. And he said, where do we go now? Well, to the homeless people who reject the capitalist world. And they say I'm not going to reform society, I'm going to live under a bridge, and I'm going to build a shed, and I'm going to paint paintings in the shed, right, and I'm going to let people look at them, modern paintings. And then you're going to reward me with 2 cups of coffee and a bottle of beer, and I'm going to be happy. I'm not going to enter the logic of capitalism, I'm not going to be employed by you. And he said these people are going to form a new force that will undermine the principles of capitalism. There is slim chance that will happen, right? So the question remains unanswered. I cannot give you an answer today, that if we do not adopt Bill Gates's proposals, what do we do to eradicate the world's inequality and the poverty phenomenon? Do not expect that I can put forward a program, because all programs are of rational design, and what is the premise for design premise? Rational design itself is not wrong, rational design's premise is that in society today there appear new forces, which you may then analyze. That would be the time for rational design to step in. Now you have not reached that point. No, whatever you design now is bound by the logic of capital. So the biggest mistake that Mr. Proudhon had made was to make the whole society capitalist, but everyone in it is a laborer. An entire society made up of capitalists, he said, that would be the solution. What will be the problem? What's the problem with his socialist theory? The production of this society still accumulates abstract labor derived from concrete labor. He is telling us this, that if we have whole society of capitalists, then it means that the whole society is the spokesperson for the accumulated abstract labor. Is this possible? I think it is impossible. The planned economic system of the socialist countries of the 20th century all followed Proudhon's doctrine. I have lived through this era. At the time I was already a grown-up. That was before today's reform and opening up. And I worked as a worker in a factory in that era of planned economy. I worked as a worker in a factory, fully expecting, since we are all workers, even the director of the factory is treated as a worker. But the director of the factory should make less than the worker, and bonuses were paid only to the workers. The cadres at that time followed that practice. We were suitably moved, weren't we? But that was the result of Mao Zedong's pressure. What if Mao had not exerted this pressure? After all, the director of the factory is the director of the factory, and he must become the human equation to the accumulation of abstract labor. A new bureaucratic capitalist class emerges. This is true in both the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Some time later, a person wrote a book called The New Class. A philosopher in Yugoslavia wrote The New Class. He says that in the era of planned economy, while ownership is shared by the entire population, and you may call this socialism, you would still recognize the law of value, right? Because different varieties of goods exist. When there is exchange between different categories, the value of the goods emerge during the exchange. You need to establish value. You can't endlessly produce double happiness table tennis balls. For example, at that time the national production of double happiness table tennis balls when they went to count was 700 million units. At that time China's population was 700 million people. The entire nation would not have been able to use up the production for 10 years. Even though double happiness table tennis balls are successfully produced, can their value be realized? It cannot be realized. Therefore, Mao Zedong said that we, the leaders of the Communist Party of China, the cadres of the economy, should enroll in the great school of the law of value. You have to study economics, right? But Mao Zedong knew what it meant to study economics. At the same time, it meant that the law of surplus value had to work. The accumulation of abstract labor through surplus value. Who would be most interested in surplus value? It must be the director of the plant. Although he is a state official, as the manager of this enterprise he should be interested in the accumulation of surplus value, so the motivation for this interest causes his salary to be different from that of the common worker, right? This is inevitable.